The morning started like any other Tuesday at Riverside Elementary School. Children rushed through the hallways with their backpacks bouncing against their shoulders. The smell of cafeteria breakfast filled the air. Teachers stood at their classroom doors, greeting students with smiles and high fives. 28-year-old Grace Thompson stood in the gymnasium, clipboard in hand, watching the third graders file in for the weekly assembly. Her brown hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and she wore her favorite sweater with tiny butterflies stitched on the collar. The children loved Miss Thompson. She had a way of making even the quietest student feel special. "All right, everyone, find your spots on the floor," Grace called out, her voice echoing slightly in the large space. The children scrambled to sit in neat rows, their excited chatter filling the room. Grace was about to start the morning announcements when something felt wrong. The clipboard slipped from her fingers and clattered to the floor. Her vision blurred at the edges. She tried to take a step forward, but her legs wouldn't respond. The last thing she heard was the sound of children screaming before everything went dark. Principal Davis was the first to reach her. Grace lay motionless on the polished gym floor, her body frighteningly still. Someone called 911 while another teacher ushered the terrified children out of the gymnasium. Within minutes, sirens wailed outside the school. Across town, David Thompson was fixing a leaky pipe under a kitchen sink when his phone rang. At 62 years old, he still took odd jobs around the neighborhood, mostly helping elderly folks with repairs they couldn't manage themselves. The number on his screen was unfamiliar. "Mr. Thompson," a woman's voice said urgently, "this is Riverside Memorial Hospital. Your daughter has been brought in by ambulance. You need to come right away." The wrench fell from David's hand. His heart pounded so hard he could hear it in his ears. "What happened? Is she okay?" "Sir, please come to the emergency department as soon as possible. The doctors will explain everything when you arrive." David didn't remember the drive to the hospital. He didn't remember parking his truck or running through the automatic doors. All he knew was that his little girl, his only child, was somewhere in this building and something terrible had happened. A nurse led him through a maze of corridors. The fluorescent lights above seemed too bright. Everything moved in slow motion and too fast at the same time. They stopped outside a room with drawn curtains. "Mr. Thompson," a young doctor approached him, her face serious. "I'm Dr. Linda Hayes. Your daughter is stable right now, but her condition is critical. She suffered what we believe is a ruptured brain aneurysm. We're running tests to determine the full extent of the damage." David felt the floor tilt beneath his feet. "Can I see her?" The doctor nodded and pulled back the curtain. Nothing could have prepared him for what he saw. Grace lay in a hospital bed, tubes running from her arms, a breathing tube in her mouth, and monitors beeping steadily around her. Her face looked peaceful, almost like she was sleeping, but David knew better. This wasn't sleep. "We've induced a coma to help reduce the swelling in her brain," Dr. Hayes explained gently. "The next few days will be critical. We'll know more once the swelling goes down." David pulled a chair close to the bed and took his daughter's hand. It was warm but limp in his grip. He thought about the day she was born, how tiny her hand had been wrapped around his finger. He thought about teaching her to ride a bike, watching her graduate from college the day she got her teaching license. His wife, Margaret, had passed away when Grace was only 12. A car accident on an icy road, sudden and devastating. David had raised Grace alone after that, the two of them against the world. She was everything to him. His reason for getting up in the morning. His proudest achievement. "Gracie," he whispered, using the nickname he'd called her since she was little. "I'm here, sweetheart. Dad's here." The days that followed blurred together into an endless nightmare. Grace remained in the intensive care unit, her body kept alive by machines. David barely left her side. The hospital staff brought him coffee and sandwiches that he rarely touched. His sister Patricia flew in from 2 states away. She tried to get him to go home to rest, but he refused. "What if she wakes up and I'm not here?" he said, his eyes red from lack of sleep. "What if she needs me?" More tests were done. Brain scans showed the damage was extensive. The aneurysm had ruptured in a critical area. Days turned into a week, then 2 weeks. Grace showed no signs of improvement. The breathing tube remained. Her eyes stayed closed. The monitors continued their steady beeping, the only proof that her heart was still beating. Dr. Hayes was joined by a specialist, Dr. Raymond Foster, a neurologist with over 30 years of experience. He was a tall man with silver hair and a kind but honest face. David both dreaded and anticipated his visits because he always told the truth, even when it hurt. 3 weeks after Grace's collapse, Dr. Foster asked David and Patricia to join him in a small consultation room. The walls were painted a calming blue, with generic landscape paintings hung at precise intervals. A box of tissues sat on the table. David had seen enough medical dramas to know what that meant. "I'm going to be direct with you," Dr. Foster began, folding his hands on the table. "Grace's brain activity is minimal. We've done multiple EEGs and the results are not encouraging. The damage from the aneurysm was severe. Even if she were to wake up, which is highly unlikely at this point, the quality of life would be extremely limited." Patricia reached for David's hand, but he pulled away, shaking his head. "No, don't say that. Mr. Thompson, I understand this is devastating," the doctor continued, his voice gentle but firm. "But we need to discuss realistic expectations. Grace has shown no meaningful response to stimuli. Her prognosis is poor. Many families in this situation begin to consider what the patient would have wanted. She's not a patient," David said, his voice rising. "She's my daughter. She's 28 years old. She has a classroom full of kids waiting for her. She has her whole life ahead of her." "I know this isn't what you want to hear," Dr. Foster said, "but after this length of time with this level of brain injury, the chances of recovery are nearly impossible. I've seen cases like this before. The kindest thing might be to let her go peacefully." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. "Let her go, give up, say goodbye." David stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "I'm not giving up on my daughter. I don't care what your statistics say. I don't care how impossible it seems. That's my little girl in there, and I'm not letting her go." He walked out of the room, leaving Patricia and the doctors behind. His footsteps echoed down the hallway as he made his way back to Grace's room. He sat down in his usual chair, took her hand, and held it tight. "I don't care what they say, Gracie," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I'm not giving up. You hear me? I'm not giving up on you." Outside the window, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. But David didn't notice. His entire world had narrowed to this hospital room, this bed, this moment. And somewhere deep in his heart, beneath the fear and the grief, a small spark of hope refused to die. David's days became a routine that most people couldn't imagine living through. He arrived at the hospital before sunrise and stayed until the nurses gently reminded him that visiting hours had ended. Even then, he often slept in the waiting room, curled up on the uncomfortable plastic chairs, refusing to go home to an empty house. Every morning, he would pull his chair close to Grace's bed and talk to her. He told her about the weather outside, about the neighbors asking about her, about the cards that kept arriving from her students. The windowsill of her hospital room was covered with colorful drawings, stick figures holding hands with Miss Thompson, hearts and flowers, get well soon messages written in crayon with backwards letters. "Little Tommy drew you another picture," David said one morning, holding up a drawing of a smiling sun. "He wrote 'I miss you' at the bottom." Well, he spelled it 'I miss you,' but you'd know what he meant. He carefully propped the drawing among the others. "Your whole class misses you, sweetheart. They made a banner that says, 'Come back soon, Miss Thompson.' Principal Davis sent a photo of it." Grace's face remained peaceful and still. The machines continued their rhythmic beeping. The ventilator breathed for her with mechanical precision. David squeezed her hand, searching for any sign, any flicker of response. Nothing. Patricia visited every few days, bringing fresh clothes for David and homemade meals he barely touched. She worried about her brother. He'd lost weight. Dark circles hung under his eyes. He looked 10 years older than he had a month ago. "David, you need to take care of yourself," she said, unpacking containers of soup and sandwiches. "Grace would want you to eat. To rest." "I'm fine," he insisted, though they both knew it was a lie. "You're not fine. None of this is fine." Patricia sat down across from him, her voice gentle but firm. "Have you thought about what Dr. Foster said? About her wishes?" David's jaw tightened. "Don't. We have to talk about it eventually. It's been over a month now. The doctors are saying the same thing. There's no brain activity. She's not coming back. Get out." David's voice was quiet but hard as steel. "David, I'm trying to help." "I said get out." He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "If you're going to come here and tell me to give up on my daughter, then I don't want you here." Patricia left with tears in her eyes. David immediately felt guilty, but he couldn't bring himself to apologize. How could she understand? Grace was all he had left. Without her, he had nothing. The hospital staff began to recognize him. Nurses would nod sympathetically when they passed. The cafeteria workers knew his coffee order. The security guard at the night entrance stopped asking for his ID. He became part of the furniture, a fixture of the ICU, the father who wouldn't leave. One afternoon, Dr. Hayes stopped by during her rounds. She'd been checking on Grace regularly, and David appreciated that she still treated his daughter like a person, not just a case file. "How are you holding up, Mr. Thompson?" she asked. "I'm okay," David replied automatically. Dr. Hayes pulled up a stool and sat down. "Can I tell you something? Off the record?" David nodded, curious. "I've been a doctor for 8 years now. I've seen a lot of cases like Grace's, and I've learned that medicine doesn't have all the answers. We deal in probabilities and statistics, but we don't know everything." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "What I'm saying is, hope isn't foolish. It's human. Don't let anyone take that away from you." "Thank you," David whispered, his voice thick with emotion. After she left, David opened the book he'd been reading to Grace. It was her favorite novel from high school, a worn paperback she'd read so many times the spine was cracked and pages dog-eared. He read chapter after chapter, his voice filling the quiet room, imagining that somewhere deep inside she could hear him. Grace's Uncle Tom and Aunt Helen came to visit. They were Margaret's brother and sister-in-law, and they'd been part of Grace's life since she was born. But the visit didn't go well. "David, we love Grace as much as you do," Tom said carefully. "But we have to face facts. It's been 6 weeks. The doctors have all said the same thing. I don't care what they've said." Helen reached out to touch his arm. She wouldn't want to live like this, hooked up to machines, no quality of life. "You don't know what she'd want," David interrupted, pulling away from her touch. "None of us really know. And as long as there's even the smallest chance, I'm not giving up." "There is no chance," Tom said, his voice rising with frustration. "You're keeping her body alive, but she's already gone. Can't you see that? This isn't Grace anymore. Grace is gone." The words hit David like a physical blow. "Get out," he said coldly. "Both of you. Get out and don't come back." After they left, David sat in the quiet room with his head in his hands. Doubt crept in like cold water seeping through cracks. What if they were right? What if he was being selfish, keeping her alive, when she was already gone? What if he was causing her to suffer? He looked at his daughter's face, so peaceful on the white pillow. The breathing tube obscured her features, making her look like a stranger, but she was still his Gracie, still his little girl. "I don't know what to do," he whispered to her. "Everyone's telling me to let you go. They think I'm crazy for holding on. Maybe I am crazy. But I remember when you were 6 years old and you had pneumonia. The fever was so high and you were so sick. Your mom and I took turns sitting with you all night, and you fought through it. You were always a fighter, Gracie." His voice broke, tears streaming down his face. "I remember when your mom died and you were so heartbroken. You didn't speak for 2 whole weeks. Everyone said you needed therapy, that you'd never be the same. But you found your way back. You always found your way back." He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "I know you're in there somewhere. I know you're fighting, and I'm going to fight with you. I don't care how long it takes." That night, alone in the dimly lit room with only the glow of the monitors for light, David felt more tired than he'd ever felt in his life. Tired in his bones, in his soul. He rested his head on the edge of Grace's bed, still holding her hand. Sleep came in fits and starts. In his dreams, Grace was a little girl again, running through sprinklers in the backyard, laughing with pure joy. Margaret was there too, smiling and waving. Then he was in a church and he could hear singing. Beautiful, soaring music that made his heart ache. David woke with a start. The dream faded, but the echo of that music stayed with him. He sat up, rubbing his face, trying to remember where he'd heard that song before. Then it came to him. It was a hymn. an old hymn that Margaret used to sing when she did housework. Grace had loved it as a child. She used to sing it in the church choir, her young voice clear and sweet. He couldn't remember all the words, but he remembered the melody. Without thinking about it, he began to hum softly. The tune was simple and comforting, a prayer set to music. In the darkness of the hospital room, with machines beeping their steady rhythm and his daughter breathing only because a machine breathed for her, David hummed that old hymn. He didn't know why. He just knew that somehow it felt right. A nurse passing by paused at the door, listening to the soft melody drifting from room 317. She smiled sadly and continued on her rounds. Another father, she thought, doing whatever he could to hold on to hope. But hope, as David was about to discover, sometimes comes in the most unexpected forms. And sometimes the things we dismiss as impossible are simply waiting for the right moment to prove everyone wrong. The next morning, David woke up stiff and sore from sleeping in the chair. Sunlight streamed through the hospital window, falling across Grace's bed in golden stripes. He stretched his aching back and looked at his daughter. She looked exactly the same as she had for the past 6 weeks. No change, no improvement. But something felt different inside David. That hymn from his dream kept running through his mind. He couldn't shake it. The melody played over and over in his head like a radio that wouldn't turn off. After his morning coffee from the cafeteria, David settled back into his chair. He held Grace's hand and cleared his throat. His singing voice had never been good. Margaret used to tease him about it, saying he couldn't carry a tune in a bucket. But Grace had never cared. When she was little, she'd beg him to sing her to sleep, even though he was terribly off-key. "Remember this one, sweetheart," he said softly. Then quietly he began to sing the hymn. His voice cracked on the first few words. He forgot some of the lyrics and had to hum through those parts. But he kept going, singing the verses he remembered. From Sunday mornings long ago, from Margaret humming in the kitchen, from Grace's sweet voice in the church choir, nothing happened. Grace lay still, the ventilator continuing its steady rhythm. David finished the song and sat back, feeling foolish. What had he expected? That she'd suddenly wake up because he sang to her? The doctors were right. He was grasping at straws. But the next day he sang again, and the day after that. It became part of his routine. He'd arrive in the morning, talk to Grace about the day ahead, read from her favorite book, and then sing the hymn, sometimes twice a day, sometimes more. The nurses noticed. They were kind about it, never telling him to stop, even though his singing wasn't exactly pleasant to listen to. One nurse, a middle-aged woman named Rita, even smiled when she heard him. "That's beautiful," she said, though they both knew his singing was far from beautiful. "What's the song?" "Just an old hymn," David replied. "My wife used to sing it. Grace loved it when she was growing up." Rita nodded and went about checking the monitors. But as she adjusted Grace's IV, she paused. "Huh," she said quietly. "What?" David asked, immediately alert. "Probably nothing. Just thought I saw a change in her heart rate on the monitor. But it's back to normal now." She smiled reassuringly. "These machines are sensitive. Sometimes they pick up little fluctuations that don't mean anything." David's heart raced. "What kind of change?" "Really, Mr. Thompson, it was nothing significant, just a tiny blip." Rita finished her work and left the room, but David couldn't let it go. That night, he barely slept. He kept thinking about what Rita had said, a change in heart rate. When had it happened? He tried to remember the exact moment. Had it been when he was singing? The next morning, David was at the hospital before dawn. He waited impatiently for the day shift nurses to arrive. When Rita came in, he cornered her immediately. "When you saw that change in Grace's heart rate yesterday, when exactly was it?" he asked. Rita thought for a moment. "I'm not entirely sure. I think it was when you were singing. But Mr. Thompson, please don't read too much into this. Patients have fluctuations all the time. It doesn't necessarily mean anything." But David couldn't help reading into it. That morning, he sang the hymn 3 times in a row, watching the monitors like a hawk. He thought he saw something during the second song, a tiny change in the pattern on the screen, but it was so small he couldn't be sure. "Did you see that?" he asked Rita when she came to check on Grace. She looked at the monitor readings carefully. "Her vitals are stable, Mr. Thompson. Everything looks normal." "But did they change? Even a little bit?" Rita hesitated. She didn't want to give him false hope, but she also didn't want to lie. There might have been a very slight elevation in heart rate, but it could be coincidental, it could be anything. "It's not coincidental," David said firmly. "It happens when I sing. I know it does." Over the next few days, David became obsessed with documenting every tiny change. He borrowed a notebook from the nurse's station and wrote down the time every time he sang, and any changes he noticed, no matter how small. Most of the time, nothing obvious happened, but occasionally he swore he saw something. A flutter on the heart monitor. A tiny change in her breathing pattern, even though the machine was doing the breathing for her. The medical staff began to worry about him. Dr. Hayes gently suggested he might be seeing patterns that weren't really there, that his mind was playing tricks on him because he wanted so desperately to see improvement. "The human brain is wired to find patterns," she explained kindly. "When we want something badly enough, we can convince ourselves we're seeing signs that aren't really there." But David wouldn't be swayed. "I know what I'm seeing. Something changes when I sing to her." Dr. Foster was less gentle. During his weekly check-in, he looked at David with concern that bordered on pity. "Mr. Thompson, Grace's condition hasn't changed. The brain scans show no improvement. I understand that you're looking for any sign of hope, but creating false narratives isn't healthy for you or your daughter." "I'm not creating anything," David insisted. "Ask the nurses. They've seen the changes too. Minor fluctuations in vital signs are completely normal and don't indicate consciousness or awareness," Dr. Foster said firmly. "I'm sorry, but I have to be honest with you. It's been 7 weeks now. We need to have a serious conversation about next steps." David stood up abruptly. "The next step is that I'm going to keep singing to my daughter. And one day she's going to wake up and prove all of you wrong." He walked out before the doctor could respond, but as he made his way back to Grace's room, doubt crept in again. Was he losing his mind? Was he so desperate to see improvement that he was imagining things? Maybe everyone was right. Maybe he needed to face reality. Grace looked so small in that hospital bed. 7 weeks of lying still had made her thinner. Her cheekbones were more prominent. Her skin was pale from lack of sunlight. But she was still breathing. Her heart was still beating. And as long as those things were true, David couldn't give up. He sat down and took her hand. "I don't care what they say, Gracie. I know you're in there. I know you can hear me." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Give me a sign, baby girl. Any sign at all. Move your finger. Squeeze my hand, anything." Nothing happened. The machines beeped their steady rhythm. The ventilator hissed and clicked. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. David began to sing. His voice was rough with emotion, cracking on the high notes, but he sang the whole hymn through. Then he sang it again. And again, on the 4th repetition, something happened. It was so quick that David almost missed it. Grace's right index finger twitched. Just once, just barely. But it moved. David's heart stopped. He stared at her hand, gripping it tighter. "Gracie, did you do that? Can you do it again?" He held his breath, watching her fingers with desperate intensity. Nothing. Had he imagined it? Was his mind playing tricks on him like Dr. Foster said? Then it happened again. Her finger moved. Not much, just a tiny twitch, but it was deliberate. It was real. "Nurse," David shouted, not taking his eyes off Grace's hand. "Nurse, come quick!" Rita rushed in, alarmed by the urgency in his voice. "What's wrong?" Her finger moved. "I saw it move." She moved her finger. Rita came to the bedside, her professional calm firmly in place. "Mr. Thompson, sometimes there are involuntary muscle movements. This wasn't involuntary. Watch." David started singing again, his voice shaking with excitement and hope. They both stared at Grace's hand. Seconds passed. Then as David reached the chorus of the hymn, Grace's finger twitched again. Rita's eyes widened. "Did you see that?" David asked frantically. "I saw something," Rita admitted cautiously. "Let me get Dr. Hayes." Within minutes, Dr. Hayes was in the room. David sang the hymn again while she watched carefully. When Grace's finger moved, the doctor's professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing genuine surprise. "That's interesting," she said, pulling out a penlight. She lifted Grace's eyelid and shone the light in her eye, checking for pupil response. "Mr. Thompson, keep singing. Don't stop." David's voice was rough and unsteady, but he sang while Dr. Hayes performed a series of tests. She pressed on Grace's fingernails, checking for pain response. She ran her pen along the bottom of Grace's foot. She called for more tests, more scans, more monitoring. The room filled with medical staff. Residents and nurses crowded around to watch. David kept singing, his voice growing hoarse, but he didn't care. His daughter had moved. After 7 weeks of nothing, she had moved. It wasn't much. It wasn't her waking up or opening her eyes. But it was something. It was proof that she was still in there, still fighting, still alive in ways that the machines couldn't measure. As David finished the hymn one more time, exhausted and emotional, he looked at his daughter's face, and though her eyes remained closed, though the breathing tube was still in place, though she lay as still as ever, he knew with absolute certainty that he'd been right to hold on. "That's my girl," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "That's my fighter. I knew you were in there. I knew it." The hospital room that had been quiet for 7 weeks suddenly buzzed with activity. Doctors David had never seen before came to examine Grace. They ordered new tests, new scans, new monitoring equipment. The finger movement had changed everything. Dr. Foster arrived within the hour, his expression a mixture of professional curiosity and something that looked like disbelief. He performed his own neurological tests while David stood in the corner, still shaking from what he'd witnessed. "Sing again," Dr. Foster instructed. David's throat was raw, but he sang. His voice cracked and wavered, but he pushed through every verse of that hymn. Grace's finger twitched twice during the song. Small movements, barely noticeable, but they were there. They were real. Dr. Foster said nothing for a long moment, staring at the monitors. Finally, he spoke. "This is unexpected. I won't pretend otherwise. We'll need to run a full series of neurological assessments. But Mr. Thompson, I need you to understand that this doesn't necessarily mean recovery. It could be a reflex." "It could be." "It's not a reflex," David interrupted. "It happens when I sing, every time." "We'll monitor it closely," Dr. Foster said carefully. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves." But David was already ahead of himself. For the first time in 7 weeks, he allowed himself to truly hope. He called Patricia, his voice breaking as he told her what happened. She arrived within hours, her earlier frustration forgotten. "Sing it again," she urged, standing beside the bed. "Please, David, sing it again." So he sang, and they both watched Grace's hand like it held all the answers to the universe. When her finger moved, Patricia gasped and grabbed David's arm. They stood there together, crying and laughing at the same time, watching for every tiny sign that Grace was still fighting. The next 48 hours were a blur of tests and monitoring. David sang the hymn so many times he lost count. Sometimes Grace responded with the finger movement. Sometimes nothing happened. But the doctors confirmed that the movements were voluntary, not reflexive. Something in Grace's brain was responding to the music, to her father's voice, to that specific song. On the 3rd day after the first movement, something incredible happened. David was singing during the morning, his voice hoarse and tired when Grace's eyelids fluttered. It was so quick that he almost missed it. But it happened again, a definite flutter, like she was trying to open her eyes but couldn't quite manage it. "Grace." David jumped up, leaning over the bed. "Can you hear me?" "Open your eyes, sweetheart. Try to open your eyes." Her eyelids moved again, struggling against some invisible weight. David kept talking, kept encouraging, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. And then after what felt like an eternity, Grace's eyes opened, just a little bit, just enough to see a sliver of brown iris. But they opened. David hit the call button repeatedly, shouting for the nurses. The room filled with medical staff within seconds. Grace's eyes had closed again, the effort apparently too much. But everyone had seen the monitors spike with brain activity during those brief moments of consciousness. Dr. Hayes examined Grace thoroughly, shining lights in her eyes, asking David to sing again, documenting every response. "This is remarkable," she kept saying. "Truly remarkable." Dr. Foster was more cautious. "She's showing signs of emerging from the coma, which is extraordinary given her initial prognosis. But we need to be realistic about what recovery might look like. Brain injuries of this severity typically result in significant cognitive and physical impairments. I don't care, David said firmly. She's coming back. That's all that matters. Over the next week, Grace's moments of consciousness became more frequent. Her eyes would open for a few seconds at a time. She couldn't focus on anything yet, couldn't track movement or respond to commands, but she was waking up. The doctors decided to try reducing the sedation medications, allowing her body to take over more of its own functions. The day they removed the breathing tube was terrifying and hopeful at the same time. David stood beside the bed holding Grace's hand as the medical team carefully extracted the tube that had been breathing for her for almost 8 weeks. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Grace took a breath on her own, then another. The ventilator that had been her constant companion was wheeled away. Keep singing to her, Dr. Hayes encouraged. Whatever you're doing, it's working, so David sang. He sang until his voice gave out completely, until he could barely whisper. Patricia took over when he couldn't continue, though she didn't know all the words. The nurses learned the melody and hummed it during their rounds. That hymn filled room 317 from morning until night. Slowly, painfully slowly, Grace emerged from the darkness that had held her. Her eyes stayed open for longer periods. She began to track movement, following David's face as he moved around the room. She couldn't speak yet, couldn't move much beyond her fingers, but her eyes showed awareness. She was in there. She was fighting her way back. 2 weeks after the first finger movement, Grace squeezed David's hand. It was weak, barely any pressure at all, but it was intentional. He'd asked her to squeeze if she could hear him, and she did. "That's my girl," David sobbed, kissing her forehead. "You're doing so good, sweetheart. So good." The rehabilitation process was brutal. Grace had to relearn everything. How to swallow, how to speak, how to move her arms and legs. Brain damage from the aneurysm had affected her motor control and her memory. Some things came back quickly. Others seemed impossibly hard. A speech therapist worked with her for hours each day. At first, Grace could only make sounds, grunts and moans that frustrated her to tears. David stayed with her through every session, singing the hymn whenever she got upset or overwhelmed. The song had become her anchor, the one thing that could calm her when everything else was too hard. Her first word came 3 weeks after waking up. The speech therapist was working with her on simple sounds when Grace looked directly at David and whispered, "Dad." It was scratchy and barely audible, but it was clear. David broke down completely, unable to stop crying. Grace reached for him with a shaking hand, and he held her carefully, mindful of all the tubes and wires still attached to her. "I'm here, Gracie. I'm right here. I never left. I never gave up on you." Grace's recovery amazed everyone. The doctors had prepared David for the possibility that she might never walk again, never speak normally, never regain her independence. But Grace proved them wrong day after day. Her determination was fierce. Even when therapy sessions left her exhausted and in tears, she pushed forward. Physical therapy was especially difficult. The aneurysm had damaged parts of her brain that controlled coordination and fine motor skills. Simple tasks like holding a spoon or standing without support required immense effort and concentration. Grace would get frustrated, throwing things sometimes, crying often. But David was always there, singing that hymn, reminding her that she'd already accomplished the impossible. "You came back from the dead," he'd tell her during the hard moments. "You can do anything." 4 months after collapsing in the school gymnasium, Grace took her first steps. She needed a walker and 2 physical therapists supporting her, and she only managed 3 steps before her legs gave out. But she walked. The entire rehabilitation staff cheered. David cried so hard he couldn't see. Her memory was patchy. She remembered her childhood clearly, remembered her mother, remembered teaching. But the weeks leading up to the aneurysm were mostly gone. She didn't remember collapsing, didn't remember the 7 weeks in a coma. The doctors said those memories might never come back, and that was probably for the best. What she did remember somehow was the hymn. Even before she could speak full sentences, she could hum that melody. The therapists used it as motivation during difficult sessions. When Grace wanted to give up, they'd start humming, and she'd push through a few more repetitions. 5 months after the aneurysm, Grace was transferred from the hospital to an outpatient rehabilitation facility. She could walk with a cane, speak clearly, though sometimes she struggled to find words, and handle most daily tasks independently. The doctors called it a miracle. David called it answered prayers and his daughter's stubborn refusal to quit. On her last day at the hospital, the nurses who'd cared for her threw a small celebration. They brought cake and hung a banner that said, "Congratulations, Grace." The staff who'd watched David sing to his unconscious daughter for 7 weeks now watched him sing with her, both of them harmonizing on that old hymn. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Dr. Foster approached David before they left. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "I told you she was gone. I told you recovery was impossible. I was wrong." David shook his hand. "You were doing your job. You were being realistic, but sometimes reality can surprise us." "Indeed it can," Dr. Foster agreed, looking at Grace with something like wonder. "I've been practicing medicine for 30 years and I've never seen anything quite like this. Your daughter is extraordinary." "She always has been," David said, smiling at Grace as she laughed at something one of the nurses said. As they left the hospital that afternoon, Grace leaning on her cane with David's arm around her shoulders for support, she looked up at him. "Dad, why did that song work? Why did it bring me back?" David thought about it for a moment. "I don't know, sweetheart. Maybe because your mom used to sing it. Maybe because you loved it as a kid. Or maybe because it reminded you that someone was waiting for you to come home." Grace smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "Sing it one more time?" So there in the hospital parking lot, with the sun shining down and the world continuing around them, David sang that hymn one more time, and this time, his daughter sang with him. 6 months after leaving the hospital, Grace stood outside Riverside Elementary School for the first time since her collapse. Her hand trembled slightly as she gripped her cane. The building looked exactly the same, but everything felt different. She was different. "You don't have to do this today," David said gently, standing beside her. "You can take more time." "I need to see them," Grace replied, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "Those kids waited for me. They sent me drawings every week. I need to let them know I'm okay." Principal Davis had arranged for Grace to visit during recess when the third graders would be outside. Grace wasn't ready to return to full-time teaching yet. The doctors said she might never be able to handle a full classroom again. Her memory issues and occasional difficulty finding words made lesson planning challenging, but she wasn't ready to give up on teaching entirely. As they walked through the school hallways, teachers stepped out of their classrooms to greet her. Some hugged her carefully, mindful of her cane. Others just smiled with tears in their eyes. Everyone had heard about her miraculous recovery. The teacher who wasn't supposed to wake up. The coma patient who came back because her father sang to her. Grace felt overwhelmed by the attention, but she smiled and thanked everyone. When they reached the gymnasium, the same place where she'd collapsed, she paused. Her breath caught in her throat. "You okay?" David asked. Grace nodded slowly. "It's strange. I don't remember it happening, but my body remembers being here." "Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense," David assured her. They continued outside to the playground. The moment the children saw Miss Thompson, chaos erupted. Kids ran toward her from every direction, shouting her name. Teachers had to hold them back, reminding them to be gentle, that Miss Thompson was still recovering. Grace lowered herself carefully onto a bench, and the children gathered around her in a semicircle. They looked at her with wide eyes, taking in the cane, the slight tremor in her hands, the way she seemed smaller somehow than they remembered. Little Tommy, who'd drawn so many pictures for her, spoke first. "Miss Thompson, we thought you were dead." Some adults gasped, but Grace just laughed softly. "I almost was, Tommy, but I'm tougher than I look." "Did it hurt?" a girl named Ashley asked. "Being in a coma?" "I don't remember it," Grace admitted. "It's like I went to sleep one day and woke up months later. But I heard later that you all sent me drawings and messages. That meant everything to my dad and me." A boy named Christopher raised his hand politely like they were in class. "Can you still be our teacher?" Grace's eyes filled with tears. This was the question she'd been dreading. "Not right now. My brain is still healing and I need more time. But I'm working hard with my doctors and therapists, and I hope that someday, maybe I can teach again." "You're still the best teacher ever," Christopher said firmly, and the other children nodded in agreement. They spent the next 30 minutes together. The children told Grace about everything she'd missed. They showed her their new projects. They asked questions about the hospital and her recovery. Grace answered as honestly as she could, in simple terms they could understand. Before she left, the children sang a song for her. It wasn't the hymn that had brought her back, but it was a song she'd taught them before the aneurysm. Hearing their young voices singing together made Grace cry. She'd missed this so much, missed them so much. As David helped her back to the car, Grace was quiet. "I want to come back," she said finally. "I don't care if I can't do it full time. I don't care if I need help. I want to teach again." "Then we'll make it happen," David promised. "Whatever it takes." Over the next few months, Grace worked harder than ever. She pushed through physical therapy sessions that left her exhausted. She worked with a cognitive therapist to improve her memory and language skills. She practiced lesson planning at home, timing herself to see how long it took her to organize her thoughts. The school board arranged for Grace to return as a part-time assistant teacher. She would work 3 hours a day, 4 days a week, helping in various classrooms. It wasn't her own classroom, but it was a start. On her first day back at work, 9 months after the aneurysm, Grace stood at the front of a second-grade classroom with the lead teacher, Mrs. Patterson. The children stared at her curiously. "This is Miss Thompson," Mrs. Patterson explained. "She's going to be helping in our classroom. Can we give her a warm welcome?" The children clapped and Grace smiled. Her hands shook a little as she held her notes, but she took a deep breath and began reading them a story. Her voice was clear and strong. She stumbled over one word, but she recovered quickly. By the end of the story, the children were leaning forward, completely engaged. After class, Mrs. Patterson pulled Grace aside. "You're a natural," she said warmly. Those kids were captivated. Grace felt a surge of pride and relief. Maybe she could do this after all. Word of Grace's story spread beyond the school. A local news station wanted to interview her and David. At first, Grace hesitated. She wasn't sure she wanted that kind of attention, but David encouraged her. "Think about other families going through something similar," he said. "Think about the fathers sitting in hospital rooms wondering if they should give up. Your story could give them hope," so Grace agreed. The interview aired on the evening news. She and David sat together on camera, telling their story. Grace spoke about the darkness of the coma, the frustration of relearning basic skills, the fear that she'd never be herself again. David talked about the 7 weeks of vigil, the pressure to let go, and the hymn that changed everything. The response was overwhelming. Letters poured in from families across the country. People who'd lost loved ones to brain injuries. People currently sitting in ICU waiting rooms. People who'd been told to give up hope. Grace and David answered as many letters as they could, sharing their story over and over. A medical journal published a paper about Grace's case. Dr. Foster and Dr. Hayes co-authored it, documenting the unusual circumstances of her recovery. They couldn't fully explain why the hymn had worked. The theory was that music could access parts of the brain that other stimuli couldn't reach, that the emotional connection to the song and her father's voice created neural pathways that kept her connected to consciousness even when everything else failed. But theories couldn't capture the full truth of what happened in that hospital room. Some things David believed were beyond medical explanation. Sometimes love was stronger than statistics. Sometimes hope was more powerful than prognosis. A year after her collapse, Grace stood in front of her own classroom again. It was a small class, just 12 students with special needs who required extra attention and patience. The school board had created the position specifically for her, understanding her limitations but recognizing her gift for connecting with children. Grace's students loved her. She understood struggle in a way most teachers couldn't. When they got frustrated or wanted to give up, she'd tell them about her own journey, about learning to walk again, about practicing words in the mirror until her brain remembered how to make the sounds, about falling down and getting back up. And sometimes when the day was hard and the students needed comfort, Grace would teach them the hymn. The one her mother used to sing, the one her father sang to her in the darkness, the one that brought her back from the edge of forever. The school year ended with a celebration. Parents came to watch their children perform. Grace's students sang the hymn, their voices young and pure and full of hope. David sat in the front row, tears streaming down his face, watching his daughter do what doctors said would be impossible. After the performance, a parent approached David. Her daughter was one of Grace's students, a girl who struggled with learning disabilities and had made remarkable progress that year. "Thank you," the mother said, gripping David's hand. "Thank you for not giving up. If you'd listened to the doctors, if you'd let her go, My daughter wouldn't have Miss Thompson as a teacher. She wouldn't have someone who truly understands what it means to fight. David smiled, looking at Grace as she hugged each of her students goodbye for the summer. I just did what any father would do. I held on when everyone said to let go. I believed when everyone said it was hopeless. And I sang, even though I can't carry a tune to save my life. That evening, David and Grace sat on the porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Grace leaned against her father's shoulder, content and at peace. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd listened to them? Grace asked quietly. If you'd given up? David was quiet for a long moment. Every day, he admitted, and every day I thank God I didn't. You taught me something during those weeks, even though you were asleep. You taught me that miracles don't always look like what we expect. Sometimes they're slow, sometimes they're small, but they're still miracles. Sing it for me? Grace asked like she had so many times before. So David sang the hymn one more time, his voice rough and imperfect but filled with love. And Grace joined him, their voices blending together in the fading light. The song that brought her back. The song that proved hope is never wasted. The song that reminded the world that sometimes, when doctors say forever, fathers know better. And somewhere in that music, in that simple melody, was proof that love can reach places medicine never can, and that the human spirit is stronger than any diagnosis, any statistic, any impossible odd. Grace Thompson was alive. She was teaching. She was whole. And it all started with a father who refused to stop singing,